At my son's engagement dinner, I spilled the wine. It isn't how I want to remember the night. It is how everyone else does. A small red comet arced from the crystal to my dress, slow as a confession. The chandelier threw back its lights. Forks stopped moving. Someone laughed in the distance, and it sounded like someone else's life. Bradley's hand snapped in the air. He didn't ask. He didn't say my name the way a husband says it when he's worried. He barked. The sound cut through the room like a command at the kennel. "Get down on your knees and clean it up," he said. Not in a whisper, not in a private tone. In front of Dylan, in front of our guests, in front of the man whose daughter had just said yes. I went down. My hands were shaking. The linen stuck to the back of my fingers. I could feel the warmth of the wine on my skirt, the way it took a second to understand that it would leave a mark. The room went quiet enough that I heard the silverware breathe. I felt small, as if the floor had hollowed out beneath me, and I had been expected to fit the shape of a servant. Then a presence leaned in beside me. A gentleman with a slow kindness in his face knelt down and, with a care I hadn't seen in years, placed a napkin over the stain as if it mattered less than the person beneath it. He looked at me for a moment that did not belong to that room. His eyes traveled the way someone reads the spine of a familiar book. He sighed my name. Elisabeth Marie. The syllables landed like sunlight through stained glass. My hands stopped moving. The cleaning cloth rustled on the floor. The sound of silver returning to its place seemed suddenly obscene. Everything in me recognized the voice the way a heart recognizes a long-forgotten song. Time did what time always does in these moments, split. If you're watching this, and you've made it this far, tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know who sits with me in this memory. They say the past is a different country. When Atto said my name, I could see that country in perfect, terrible color oak leaves, the smell of rain on pavement. A campus that thought the world was still being made. I was 19 under an oak tree. I had a book of poems in my lap, and a boy in my life, who read with more feeling than most people feel for dessert. He called me by a pet name I had never heard anyone use outside our little weather. He handed me a strip of daisy-white paper where he'd pressed a small flower. And he closed it in a silver locket for me, because he said he liked the way little things could be quiet proof that the world was not only safe, but gentle. Atto was not wealthy then, he was earnest. He had a crooked smile and a habit of humming lines of Elizabeth Barrett Browning when he was happy or nervous. He put his hand over mine in a way that made steadiness seem like a present we could give each other. I believed in him the way you believe in a sentence that feels inevitable. We talked about work and art and justice. He sketched buildings in the margins of his homework and said he would one day make homes that meant something to the people who lived in them. He tasted like coffee and possibility. Then I found out I was pregnant. There are small, private seismic events that rearrange an interior world. A soft sound in a sleeping child. A letter that is not what you expected. A late pregnancy test with a line that runs like a river. I stared at that test like I could negotiate with it. I was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with my body and everything to do with the map I had been handed. I could already hear how my life might be described at the edges. Someone who had made a choice. Someone who had chosen security. Someone who had not thought of herself. Margaret was practical. She supervised the internship, where I was learning to catalog manuscripts. Her hair smelled faintly of lavender and determination. She had a hand on the world that steadied it into a shape that made sense marriage to a man who could pay bills. A name that looked comfortable on the paper, A house with a garden. Margaret loved me. She thought she was saving me. She sat me down one grey afternoon with a stack of newspapers and clippings about Bradley Morrison, his investments, his chairmanship of this board and that, his reputation for steadiness. She told me a story about women who had what they thought they wanted and then were left, holding nothing. Her voice was a slow warmth that slid into the cracks of my fear. "You have a choice," she said. "You can love or you can be safe. Sometimes you cannot have both." I thought of Otto's sketches. I thought of the locket press, cold to my skin. I thought of the ways my mother's hands had always been tied by pennies and plans. At 19, the future looks complicated and eternal at once. I wanted to protect the small life inside me. Repression felt, achidamun, like devotion, a worse. I asked Otto to wait. He said he would. He promised. I married Bradley instead. Bradley looked like a promise on paper. He had a deep laugh that made people relax, a patience that read as patience, and a way of arranging his life so that it did not threaten anyone else. He made me feel like an answer for a family portrait. We had a wedding that smelled of lemon and lily and the weird brittle happiness of people who make arrangements. I held my locket beneath my dress the night I said the vows. Otto stood on the edge of a future I had opted not to step into. He sent letters that turned into dust in my mailbox. He built the very things he used to sketch. His name began to be in articles Margaret kept clippings of. He became what he had always been trying to be, someone who cared for neighborhoods, who used his money to do the work his hands had always imagined. I told myself I had made the right decision. I told myself I had saved a child and perhaps a world. We named our son Dylan. He came into the world with his father's skepticism and his grandmother's stubborn hands. He slept like a small, perfect argument between two very different people. He had water-dark hair and a dimple when he smiled. Bradley was proud. He was proud as men who have made their calculations and found them true. He bought the kind of house that did not embarrass its owners. He arranged the furniture with a mastery that made visitors feel like they were stepping into a room that had been curated for good taste. He liked things orderly, and people who liked things orderly often liked them ordered in other humans as well. At first, things were ordinary. We had Sunday mornings with papers and coffee. We had vacations that were planned down to the minute. Bradley applauded my neatness in front of guests. He praised the way I could keep the silver bright. He loved how I could make the curtains hang straight. Then the small things started, a word here, a tone there. "Careful," he would say when I picked up a glass. "Why are you always so clumsy?" he said once, as if clumsiness was a personal failing I could edit out of my life. He would correct my posture at parties, rearrange my napkin, toss a casual remark about my cooking into conversation like a verdict. He did not hit me. He had a better weapon, the constant, slow removal of dignity. He made me feel as though it was my responsibility to keep him safe from embarrassment. His small humiliations were like threads pulled tight until I could not move without tugging at them. He would snap his fingers if a server lingered. He would whisper a crisp instruction if I lingered too long over a conversation. He would, on a good night, say something sweet about my hands in private, and then, in public, remind me to refill someone's glass as though I were part of a house staff. I learned to shrink. I learned to let go of certain kinds of attention for my own survival. I put my canvases in the attic. I wrapped brushes in newspaper and told myself I would paint again when Dylan was older. When the mortgage was paid, when the reasons to wait had become respectable. I became efficient. the way a machine becomes efficient without the heat of desire, but with the same steady output. There were times when I told myself I wasn't invisible. There were small resistances. I would paint with my left hand when he wasn't looking. I would hide a small canvas in the back of my closet and touch it like a prayer when the house was dark. I would hum Browning lines under my breath. But most nights I folded myself into roles Bradley could recognize and reward. Hostess, partner, mother, neat-handed keeper of an aesthetic that matched his. Once, long before Dylan knew anything about the complexity of adults, I bent to pick up a dropped napkin at a school function and a woman I didn't know said, loud enough that everyone heard, "That's very kind." Dear. The word dear felt like a public title, like the embroidered script you find on a maid's cap. I felt the word settle on me and lay its dust. I remember thinking, with a quiet disbelief, that no one ever called me Elizabeth in rooms where it mattered. They called me whatever small thing made the work I did easier to ignore. All of this is to say that the phrase my husband used that night, the command to kneel, the presumption that I existed to tidy his life, was not a single act. It was the visible point of an invisible accumulation. Decades, 39 years, have a way of stacking micro-abuses into a structure that supports a perfect public face. Bradley's face was always impeccable. Mine became a quiet study in carefulness. Dylan grew up with a father who was proud and a mother who could disappear. He was a good son, thoughtful, kind, and painfully reluctant to suspect his father of anything worse than world-weary sarcasm. He loved me. He adored me. But he loved the idea of his father's consistency. Loyalty is a beautiful thing when it is well placed. It is also blinding. So there I was at the country club. 5 crystal chandeliers, and the hush of linen and expensive perfume. Trying to be the mother of the man who was about to get married when the wine went red across my lap. People saw the stain before they realized what had happened. Bradley's face made the shape of a man who had already told the world how to react. He had the air of someone who needed to be obeyed because obedience was the scaffolding of his self-worth. He pointed. Snapped. He made the room into a lesson. When Otto leaned down beside me, his movement was gentle enough to make a point. He didn't look at the stain. He looked at my face. For an instant, I could have described every freckle where a life had been sunburned. The fine patterns around my eyes from too many small worries. The hair that had gone silver at the temples from a series of griefs. He saw me the way someone might see the names inscribed inside a book's binding, hidden, private, crucial. His recognition was a kind of mirror. It made me realize how long I had been living as a role, not as a person. It made me aware of all the things I had traded when I married a quiet security. It pulled the locket from under my dress, in the memory, as if my fingers remembered the weight, even now. In the locket was a pressed flower, small and fragile, that smelled faintly of a summer that had been promised and not delivered. I had kept that flower for years because I believed in tokens the way small animals believe in hiding places. I told myself later that I had never stopped loving Otto. I told myself that love can live quiet and small inside the body without making a fuss. But the truth is simpler and more human. I loved what Otto represented when I was young possibility. A life built around intention rather than the careful maintenance of reputation. And I loved the man he became, in a small, grudging way, because he had not forgotten what he once promised to build. When Otto said my name, I felt the world tilt toward 2 different futures at once. The sound of Elisabeth Marty was a foy France. Bradley's face tightened to a line. I knew well the look of a man who was being stripped of the certainty that justified his command. A few heads turned toward the elderly couple at the next table. Toward the engagement, ring twinkling like a punctuation, someone cleared their throat awkwardly. Margaret, who had been at the event and who had once given me her version of salvation, flinched, and then busied herself with a napkin. Her eyes flicked toward mine with a complicated look. Apology, calculation, the quick rearranging of social furniture. Otto's recognition did more than call up memory. It interrupted habit. Habit runs deep. Habit is the thing that keeps you bending when someone else points. A stranger's gaze makes you feel odd, but a friend's gaze makes you feel naked. He recognized the girl he had loved. He recognized the woman the world had trained to disappear. And in that second, I was both of them. After the napkin, after the polite murmurs, after the way Bradley's jaw set like a hinge, Otto stood and asked to speak with me privately. He moved with a quiet purpose that made people part, like the sea. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tremor that was not fear for Bradley's reaction, but a nervousness that came with seeing old self-reflections in a new light. We left the room together like conspirators. Not because we intended anything illicit. God knows neither of us was inclined to flash romance in front of a crowd, but because there are conversations that require a pocket of privacy to be honest. He led me to a terrace where the air was the cooler color of night and the scent of the place's gardens masked the wine on my dress. He did not mention the locket right away. He did not ask for explanations or lay blame. He looked at me and asked one question I had not heard spoken aloud in decades. "Are you all right?" It was simple. It cut deeper than any accusation could have. In an instant, I knew how much I had been performing the state of being all right. I had practiced it like a speech, like a hostess greeting. I had worn it like a costume. His question made clear that someone else perceived the seams. We talked. The conversation moved with the cautiousness of two people balancing on a bridge. He spoke about the things he had done. He had worked on housing projects. He had grown a company that built homes for people who could not afford them in other ways. He had done it because he remembered a neighborhood he grew up in and because he thought it mattered that shelter be more than a shelter. He'd also never stopped wondering about me. I told him, after a while, that I had a son. There was a small silence, like a held breath. The air seemed to gather its things. He touched the inside of my wrist, where the locket usually lay, as if checking for a pulse more than for a jewel. "Where's the locket?" he asked. "How long are we doing this?" I answered, with a lightness that was, frankly, protective. But then I felt it. My hands moved and found the weight beneath the cloth of my dress. I handed it to him. He opened it carefully, as if the thing inside might be a secret lit by small electricity. The pressed flower had browned at the edges but had kept its shape. He smiled in a way that acknowledged the passing of time and the survival of small delicate things. He looked up at me then, not as he had at 19, but with a steadiness that had room for the woman I had become, the layers, the compromises, the things I had not been able to say. "I never stopped looking for you," he said. "There is a certain way the heart learns to hold truth. It is not always dramatic. Often, it sounds like a fact being placed across a table." He told me he had married only briefly, and that it had not worked. He asked about Dylan like a man asking about a river he had once swum in. He asked if I was happy. I did not lie. I said, rehearsed and wearied, that I did the best I could. Then he offered me something I had not expected. "If you ever need a place to paint," he said, "I have an empty studio in one of my buildings. No obligation, no talk, just space." It was a small mercy, and it came with the complicated aftertaste of a man who could give things most of us could not. I accepted his card because I wanted the physical remembrance of the offer. The way you want a bookmark in a story you cannot afford to finish. We went back to the table. Bradley's expression was something between accusation and strategy. He kept a certain distance, the kind you keep from a person you suspect may reveal you to yourself. He introduced Otto to Dylan as a benefactor of local charities. It took all of my training in mimicry to look like a woman whose world had not just cracked open. That night, I slept with the locket on my pillow. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, the memory of wine and shame, and something like possibility. I lay there thinking about the ways we make choices to protect things that might also end up protecting us from ourselves. In the days that followed Otto's recognition, the world felt both the same and not. Little things shifted. Bradley kept his eyes on me, with a new watchfulness that felt like strategy rather than affection. He asked me, a few mornings later, in a voice that was deceptively casual, whether I needed help finding anything in the house because I seemed distracted. I told him I was fine. Later, when Dylan came home from work and found me at the kitchen table with a small canvas unpacked, there was a hesitation in his smile that suggested both surprise and an unspoken question that would come later. Why had you hidden this? I began to paint a little. I started with small studies, a corner of our garden, the way light leaned on Bradley's briefcase as he read the paper. The pressed flower no longer wearing its original white, but still an architecture of remembered summers. The brush felt foreign and intimate at once. It woke muscles that had been asleep. It made me feel like someone who had been learning to speak a new language, and finding that the words the tongue had forgotten still existed under the dust. I kept the meetings with Otto private, arranged at odd times, as if secrecy were a necessary safety net. He did not press. He did not dramatize. He asked where I left the locket when I painted. He brought me books on color and composition and would stand a respectful distance away as I worked, like a man who had learned how to be present without overstepping. He offered to sit more than once with quiet, like vitaliness rather than a show of power. There were good nights. There were nights when I arrived home with paint on my fingers and Bradley would not notice. There were other nights when the quiet of the garage felt like a second punishment. Sometimes I wanted to tell Dylan everything. Sometimes I wanted to scream into a pillow until every old choice was unearthed. Mostly, I watched how the edges of my life softened as the act of creating returned some color to my days. I did not tell Dylan about Otto at first. How do you tell your son that the man you had told him all his life was his father might have been someone else? How do you explain that the man who made your childhood feel safe might have done so, while also building a life where your mother's name was seldom used? There is a sort of arithmetic to loyalty that I did not want to disturb lightly. I thought about time, about how long it had been since my decisions were made in a frightened hurry. I thought about Dylan's face the night he had said yes to Sophia and how his joy had looked earnest and luminous. I wanted to protect that. Yet the presence of Otto meant secrets were no longer only mine. They had become a kind of pressure that could not be contained by silence. When a secret lives in the dark for long enough, it does one of two things. It calcifies into a stone you carry, or it cracks open the walls it sits behind. Bradley whimpered in ways that people think are only small. He worked the levers of money and shame and patronized me as a joke in front of friends. A friend once told him, laughing, "You put her to work for you, lucky man." They meant it playfully. Bradley smiled like a man who has won a prize. I stood there with my hands pressed to the rim of a glass and felt the way a life might be reduced to a serving role, without anyone noting the theft. A few times, I rehearsed what it might be to say no. Not the big, dramatic no divorce. No scandal but the small ones. What would it be like to refuse to pick up a napkin? To hold my head high and say, simply, no. The thought of it was intoxicating and terrifying. It was a muscle I had not used in 39 years. Sometimes in the privacy of my studio, I would whisper to the canvases, "One day I won't be your maid." The phrase felt enormous in the dark. It was both a statement of anger and a talisman against further erasure. It gave me a particular clarity of purpose, to remember myself as someone other than a keeper of other people's comfort. Otto watched me unlearn habits with a patience that sometimes felt like a mirror. He offered space. He offered time. He asked little questions, as if wanting to understand the geography of choices I had made. He was not a rescuer. He was a man who had been given the tools to help. And he used them with the carefulness of someone who knows that money can be a hard thing to offer without causing harm. People will sometimes say that's the difference between a man who loves and one who doesn't. The way he helps you find yourself again while allowing you to keep the dignity of the search. Otto knew my name. He used it with a reverence that felt like prayer. Bradley used my usefulness like a slogan. The weeks after the dinner unfolded into a strange chronology where little revolutions occurred inside the same old rooms. I began to meet with Otto for coffee in the kind of places that smelled of beans and soft light. He came to a gallery opening where my friend had work displayed and asked me outside the crush of people whether I ever thought about showing my own work. I said no, because the answer felt like exposing a truth I did not yet own. He asked about the locket. He asked about the pressed flower. He never asked about paternity. He stood in the place of someone who saw the life I had lived and did not flinch. And then, one evening, he placed a plain envelope on my kitchen table. There was a small handwritten note, a studio address and a time. No pressure, no arrangement. A resource offered, not demanded. I ran my fingers over the handwriting and felt a heat gather in my chest that was not all nostalgia. It was recognition that someone that had once loved me had not only remembered, but had quietly chosen to act. My hands hovered over the locket again. I thought about Margaret's voice, about the way choices were presented to me like doors that were the only ones available. I thought about how the word security had once been a promise and had become, in many ways, my cage. I thought about Dylan's face at the engagement table and the way his hand found Sophia's, as if to anchor a future. I thought about the practicalities, the mortgage, the neighborhood. The fact that Bradley's name on the deeds was not a trivial thing. There are arithmetic things you think about when you contemplate other lives' numbers of days, the cost of leaving, the burden of starting over. There are also human calculations no spreadsheet can account for, the measure of shame you have carried, and how it warps your ability to see the self beneath. I did not have an answer. I had a feeling that the night of the spill had been less about a cloth, and more about the exposure of a life. That had been cobbled together at the expense of naming. There are moments when a life can be compressed to one image. For me, it was that napkin on my skirt, the command, the way people's eyes slid away and then back again. It was the way Otto knelt beside me and did not treat me as a domestic task, but as a person who might be worthy of attention for who she was rather than what she did. It was that whisper of my name that split my world into before and after. That night, when I went to bed, I lay with the locket on my pillow and thought about confession. Not the kind that seeks absolution, but the kind that offers truth. There was a weight to these things that was not only personal. Secrets change other people's stories too. I loved Dylan. I had protected him in the way I thought a mother protects, by building a life that would keep him safe. But there are safeties that end up being prisons for others. I had to think about the honesty that might free him even if it hurt. I did not know how to begin. I did not even know if I was allowed to begin. I had been the one who carried the secret, who folded it into tidy bundles and hid it in drawers next to the linens. I had been the keeper of the truth. The thought of giving it up felt like a betrayal and also like a liberation. For now, I painted. I put color down on canvas, like stitches in a map I was trying to redraw. I accepted Otto's card for an open studio with the same nervous hope that comes from taking a first step. There was a steam of fear that ran through me that opening the door might change everything. There was also a kind of thrilling vertigo, the sensation of standing at an edge and seeing, at last, the possibility of flight. One afternoon, as I worked on a portrait that looked more like a map of my own hands than a person's face, my phone buzzed. A message from Dylan. He sent a photograph of him and Sophia on a bench laughing, their faces luminous. The caption read, "Can't wait for you to meet her parents. They're kind." Different, in the best way. His innocence rang in the tiny rectangle of light. I thought about how to tell him. I thought about how my telling might rearrange the coordinates of his life. The phone buzzed again. Bradley called. He wanted to know what time I would be home for dinner. He left a note about the bills in a voice that sounded annoyingly like a man trying to keep a ship steady in a storm he denies exists. Both calls felt like instruments of two different lives tugging at me. I pressed the brush into the canvas and felt the paint come up in a small ribbon. The pressed flower in the locket had gone brittle but still held its shape. I thought about the way identity can be kept in small things, in objects that bear witness, when memory grows thin. When Otto came to my studio for the first time, he did not bring gifts. He brought a tray of tea and a quietness that felt like a room without furniture. He walked around my work table and paused before my small studies, his hands kept respectfully behind his back. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man watching a long project finally arrive at a page. "Paint what hurts," he said simply. "You'll know what to do with it." There is a particular bravery to someone telling you a permission they cannot give you themselves. It was an offered license to be messy, to be human in front of pigments and stretchers and a world that had trained me to be otherwise. We sipped the tea, we nodded at the small victories. Then he reached out, as if for a small souvenir, and gently opened the locket again. He did not pry at the story. He only suggested, in the softest of ways, that the truth has a way of wanting to breathe. It is a dangerous thing to give a secret oxygen. It tends to move, to lift, to find cracks to escape through. I kept the locket again, and I kept the fear of telling Dylan, but something else thrummed in the bones. A promise not to be a maid forever. The next time Bradley snapped at a dinner party, ordering me to retrieve someone's coat, I almost stood up and said no. The word almost lodged like a stone in my throat. Instead, I smiled and moved. But when I passed my son, I felt his hand squeeze mine in a way that said love, but also paused. There was confusion there. The start of a question he did not yet know how to ask. That night, after the guests left and the house settled into a comfortable silence, I took the locket out and opened it under the lamplight. The flower looked smaller than memory had made it. I thought of all the things I had hidden because they were inconvenient, shameful, or messy. I thought of the stacking years and the small humiliations that meant that a woman could be treated like a maid inside her own home without anyone noticing the theft. I thought also of the man who had called me Elizabeth Marie and who had, by doing so, given me a way to hear myself. I heard an answer forming at the base of my skull. It was not a full sentence. It was a possibility that perhaps the life I had been given was not the only life I was entitled to live. I placed the locket back on the knit-stand and lay awake for a long time, watching the ceiling, counting the small fractures in the plaster like constellations. The next day would bring its own nuisances: Bradley's morning rituals, Dylan's calls, the cataloguing of the mundane that keeps a house running. It would also bring a decision I could no longer avoid. There is a moment before any major change where you can still choose the quieter way, the path of least resistance. There is also the moment after you realize that the quiet has cost you pieces you cannot get back. I would soon be standing at that fork. But first, I had to find the words. I had to decide whether to say them to my son, to Bradley, to Atto, or to no one at all. I had to find a way to call my life by its true name. The paint on my hands had dried into a pattern of small storms. I washed them and held the locket, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt like someone on the edge of a question with both terror and hope in equal measure. The next morning the house hummed with its ordinary noises, the dishwasher sighing, Bradley's newspaper folding like a ritual, the low thump of someone making coffee, as if pacing could reorder the world. I stood at the kitchen sink, with the locket in my hand, and the memory of Otto's voice, like warm rain on my skin. The paint on my palms felt like a record of the night before, a fingerprint of choice. I could feel the edges of the decision like a bruise. It ached, but the ache was honest. I knew I could no longer move in silence. The secret had been a thing I had carried alone long enough that keeping it felt less like protection and more like theft of Dylan's right to know, of my own right to be someone other than the caretaker of appearances. I rehearsed the words in my head, as if I were trying to learn a script in a language I had not used in decades. The hardest part was, and always had been, believing I had a right to speak them. The moment to tell him came on a Tuesday evening. Dylan had stopped by after work. He always lingered longer than he needed to. The way a person lingers when they are reluctant to step back into the parts of life that are arranged for them. He sat at the kitchen island with his elbows on the worn wood, as if anchoring himself to the house that had been built on decisions made before his brain could understand them. He laughed at a joke I made, and the sound was a small bright thing in the room. I thought of how his laughter had been a kind of light my life had used to keep from freezing. When he asked about my painting, really asked, not the kind of small curiosity that lives in polite conversation, I felt the words rise like a tide. They were simple at first. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. He straightened, the joke dying in his eyes, because the phrase carried the weight of gravity. He set his coffee down and waited. I told him how I had met Otto at 19, about the oak tree and the pressed flower, and the locket I kept folded close for the years when I needed a small truth to hold on to. I told him about the pregnancy and the choices that followed. About Margaret sitting me down and handing me the story of Bradley's steadiness, like a map you weren't allowed to redraw. I told him the part every mother plans the most carefully, that I had tried to protect him. Then I said the words. They felt foreign in my mouth, like a garment I had not worn recently, but had kept ironed for fear of what would happen if I let it wrinkle. "Dylan," I said, "Otto is your father." The silence that followed did not fall neatly. It dropped like a plate that did not break, but vibrated in the air, making everything else tremble. For a long minute he did not move. I expected anger, or disbelief, perhaps even laughter at the absurdity. I expected 1,000 different betrayals. What I did not expect was the way his face closed in on itself, as if being suddenly smaller would make him safer. His hands fisted on the counter. "How long?" he asked. The question was clinical, but the note underneath it was raw. How much of my life, how many stories, had been a private ledger kept from him? 39 years. Love, I said. The number landed heavy, like the last page of a ledger being shut. Dylan's first movement was not away from me but toward me. He wrapped his arms around me, as if to test whether the woman who had tucked him in at night was still there. He pressed his face into my shoulder, and I felt him tremble. He asked questions: why I had never said anything, why I had married Bradley, whether I had ever loved his father. I answered as honestly as I could. I told him that I had loved in different ways at different times, and that sometimes love looks like protection, and sometimes protection becomes a prison. When I finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at me, as if reading a new map of a place he thought he knew. He had a bleached, astonished kindness in his features, that instinctive softness that had always been his. "You should have told me," he said finally, the sentence simple and terrible. "I know," I said. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I had to keep it tidy. I was wrong." He looked toward the doorway, as if expecting Bradley to materialize and condemn us both. There was a flash of panic in him that I had not seen since he was small and got his ear glued to a marble run. "Where's he now?" Dylan asked, meaning Bradley, meaning the man whose reaction to the spill had been a public lesson in humiliation. "Out at the club," I said. "He left after." Dylan did not finish the sentence. He had already reached for his phone. For a terrifying instant, I feared he would call Bradley into a war we did not need, but instead he stood and paced, making small circles in the kitchen. Then he touched my face, in a way that felt protective and complicated. "You told him?" he asked. "No," I said. "Not yet." "I thought you should hear it from me." He exhaled sharply, as if fumbling the air between what loyalty demanded and what truth required. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Let me think." He paced again, then stopped like someone feeling the edge of a table to see if it would hold. Finally, he pulled out his phone and typed. He and I did not talk about what he wrote. He called Bradley once, heard the clipped answers, and then hung up. That evening Bradley returned home as if nothing had happened, his clothes tidy, his face a mask, arranged to deflect inquiry. He greeted us with a practiced warmth. When Dylan and I were alone in the living room later, he asked me not to mention it tonight. Not to pull a thread through the house we were all under. I understood the impulse, how often the people who build their lives on certainty will try to smooth the edges when they sense a crack, but the thought of another night, where I went to bed with a secret pressing at my ribs, felt like a betrayal of the slow work I had started in the studio. The next afternoon, when Bradley was out, Dylan came to me with a restraint in his voice that suggested he had been practicing. "I spoke with Otto," he said. "You did?" The word came out way too fast, the sound of sudden hope and sudden fear. How had he? Why? But the truth is, we were living in a world threaded together by small things, shared friends. The club, the kind of circles where a well-placed name travels like a breeze. Dylan's face softened. "He came to the club," he said. "He wanted to speak with me. He asked for privacy. He asked me not to tell anyone before we all had a chance to talk." There was awe in his voice, the kind of astonishment reserved for stories that involve wealth and old correspondences. "He knows?" I asked. Asking it aloud made the room feel unsteady. I was suddenly very afraid of my own body and what it might do, cry, or tremble, or make decisions, before I had time to think. "He suspected," Dylan said. "He said he'd always suspected. He said he never wanted to hurt you. He asked if I wanted proof. He sounded like a man trying to describe museum piece respectful. Careful, but his hand that hovered over a mug betrayed the same kind of agitation I felt. He offered to do whatever would make you comfortable, Dylan continued. He said he would step back if you wanted him to. He told me he'd memory. He said. He stopped, as if the rest was too tender to put into air. We arranged to meet with Otto that evening in a small cafe away from the club, where our world had learned how to arrange itself. Otto arrived with the quiet confidence of a man who knew how to make spaces feel safe. No entourage, a hat in hand, the same crooked smile but tempered with years. He greeted Dylan with a handshake and turned to me with an expression that had, in it, the gentle comprehension I had known since college. You did the right thing, he said simply, to me. You told him. Otto had, in his pocket, something he had been carrying for a while, an old letter he had found while going through boxes. A photograph of two young people under an oak tree, with a pressed flower lying beside them. He had also, more pragmatically, arranged for a confidential confirmation, something that would not become a spectacle but would allow truth to breathe. I will not list the details because the mechanics are not the heart of this story. It is enough to say that in the room where my son sat across from a man who had loved me before I had learned the economy of fear, some pieces slid into place. Dylan listened to Otto speak with a kind of guarded respect. He studied the photograph the way an archaeologist studies a shard, with curiosity and the sense that every fragment might have belonged to a larger whole. He asked questions, pointed ones about time and intent, and whether I had been happy, questions no son should be required to ask his mother after 39 years. I answered as best as I could. There came a night when Bradley's denial took a turn toward coercion. It was a Tuesday and the house smelled like stew. He was tired, and his tiredness sharpened into a kind of brittle control. He said before dinner that he had been hearing rumors, and that maybe I was being sentimental. He laughed in a way that was meant to close the conversation. I felt my face go hot and cold at once. The old muscle memory rose in me. Lower your voice. Smooth the crease in public. Keep the household tidy. When he turned his back to fetch a dish, something in me shifted, an energy I could no longer translate into niceness. The refrain I had been saying in the studio when no one was watching rose in my mouth. No, I said. The word was small, but it landed like a weight being placed. Bradley turned, affronted, the look of a man who had always found his worth in compliance. What did you say? Asked. I said no. I repeated, I am not your maid. I will not be ordered around as though I am a household servant. I will not let you reduce me to a role you can fill with your expectations. He laughed then, short and sharp, as if dismissing a child's tantrum. He tried to make the moment into a performance, for others a man with a wife, who occasionally flared. He moved toward me, as if to assert the command he had always used, but Dylan stepped between us. Dad, Dylan said, the single word soft but iron strong. She's not your maid. Bradley looked at him like he had misread the economy of loyalty. You're being dramatic, he said, but his voice had a tremor. He had never expected his son to choose to protect me. He had always assumed that his design of the family would go undisputed. The fact that Dylan's allegiance had shifted was a blow as much to his control as to his ego. I remember standing there thinking of the napkin on my dress, of the chandelier, and of 20 small humiliations rolled into a single command. I remember thinking the phrase then and saying it aloud, not to wound but to declare, you have treated me like a maid my entire marriage. I am leaving. I will be filing for divorce. The words had the quality of both a relay and a release. Bradley's jaw clenched. He argued at first about appearances, about the cost, about the children and stability. He used the same tools he had always used, a calm voice filled with the promise of ruin if I stepped out of line. He tried to make me doubt myself. He calculated, in his head, the social fallout. But this time the calculation did not scare me. I had spent 39 years budgeting my life around other people's fears. The politics of small cruelty no longer had hold on me. The decision to leave did not feel triumphant. It felt practical and oddly tender. The quiet arrangement of boxes that contained paintings and letters in the locket, and the scent of sun on an old sweater. Otto found a small apartment above one of his buildings with high windows, and a light that filled the room the way paint needs light. He arranged for a studio in the same complex, a second-floor space with wide doors and a skylight that let the morning in like a benediction. He did not make grand announcements. He only sighed. "Come when you're ready." His offer felt like scaffolding rather than rescue help that allowed me to do the work rather than transform me into an object of gratitude. There were practicalities, of course. Bradley's first move was to make the separation unpleasant in the ways someone with resources knows how. He delayed certain payments, suggested I might be irresponsible, withheld items he thought would be leverage. He called friends and subtly positioned me as unstable. He insinuated in private conversations that my sudden artistry was a midlife flair for attention. He understood social maneuvering the way some men understand chess, one measured indifference at a time. Dylan became my closest ally. He sat with me through a lawyer meeting that I will not describe here in detail. Legal matters are cumbersome, and they bore down on me like the weather, but he listened while I read the papers, his hand on top of mine. He made calls I couldn't have made, arranged for a moving company, when my hands shook too much to clean the brushes. He held me on nights, when panic rose like tidewater, and I felt I might drown in the novelty of my own life. Otto's help was discreet. He arranged for legal counsel through a firm. He offered to cover certain costs, so I would not be fighting an uphill battle with my hands tied. He did not make his assistance into spectacle. He understood the dignity of a woman who is learning to make decisions again. When friends asked, he said simply that he admired my work and wanted me to have the chance to focus on it. He did not buy my freedom. He made sure I had the tools to purchase it with my own steps. That distinction mattered. The months that followed were not clean. They were neither movie-like nor full of doom. They were a series of small transactions and emotional weather, mediation sessions that felt like board meetings. Late nights, unpacking canvas, mornings when the sound of a kettle made me think of decision. I experienced waves of guilt and grief, and an odd brightness that sometimes made my stomach flip, the return of possibility. I found that liberation is less a single glorious moment than a long negotiation with fear. The late autumn when the papers were finally served and the house keys exchanged was not cinematic. It was heavy with the ordinary things that make up a life, the timing of mortgage payments, the administration of possessions, the drawing up of a new map for a child who had grown up under a particular set of rules. Bradley thought some items portrayed them as sentimental relics that belonged to both, but the weight of his public demeanor had shifted. People who knew us were surprised. Some offered quiet condolences. Others kept their distance. When my name was finally placed on the lease of the studio, I remember standing in the empty room with the sunlight cutting across the floor and thinking about the way light reveals dust, and also the way it reveals possibility. The late bloomers signed something. I had scribbled on a scrap of paper one sleepless night went up months later, after I had hosted a class of older women who wanted to try painting. because their hands had always been busy for others. The class was small at first, 3 women, 2 brushes and a laugh, but it felt like kinship. We were all women who had held other people's lives long enough to forget how to hold our own. The studio smelled of oil and coffee, and the slightly intoxicating smell of new paint. I taught with a quiet patience, showing students how to mix a color, rather than prescribing what their lives should look like. We painted mornings and afternoons, and sometimes into the evening light. We shared stories on breaks, which turned the studio into something more than a classroom, a confessional without sermon. A place where hands learn to make marks not for anyone else's comfort but for their own joy. I sold my first painting an afternoon study of a corner of the garden, a piece of sky caught behind a washing line, to a woman who cried when she picked it up. "This looks like courage," she said, as if courage was something that could be hung on a wall. The sale paid a portion of a bill, but more than that, it felt like recognition. The first exhibition happened 6 months after I'd moved into the studio. Otto found a small gallery in a neighborhood that liked quiet things and asked if they would host a show for a group he liked to support. He paid for the printing of invitations and then told me not to feel beholden. "It's your show," he said. "I'm only the one who opens the door." The opening night surprised me. People I knew came, not all of them, but enough. Dylan stood beneath a painting of his childhood street, his mouth soft with a pride I had not expected so soon. Sophia was there too, radiant and kind. She moved through the room like someone whose presence calms the air. She had met Otto's daughter in 1,000 small, civilized ways, and yet being present felt singularly brave. Margaret came. I thought she might avoid the event entirely. She arrived late, wearing a coat that had seen better winters, and stood at the back of the room with a small glass of wine. Her eyes found mine, and I felt something like a small, cautious hopi. She had been a woman who steered me into a life I had not fully wanted, and then swallowed her role like a bitter pill. When she stepped forward, she walked slowly, as if rehearsing the apology. "Elizabeth," she said, and the word was an old thing, softened by time. "I have been feeling foolish for many years. I thought I was helping. You could have built a religion on Margaret's good intentions and called it charity. But intentions, even well-meaning ones, sometimes do not account for the consequences." She stood in front of me, and in the pause between us, I felt 40 years of youth and decisions laid bare. "I am sorry," she said. "I saw the world as a safer place, if you were safe in it. I did not see myself. I did not see how much I was asking you to hide. I was wrong." Her apology did not fix things. It did not erase a life lived under thin compromises. But it was an honest thing, and honest things do change the atmosphere of a room. I accepted her apology with the careful generosity that has to be learned. Forgiveness, I had learned, is more like a decision to stop sharpening the weapon than it is a magical eraser. The show was modestly successful. A few pieces sold. Others were given new homes through private buyers. The reviews were small, intimate appreciations in neighborhood papers that made me feel seen rather than exhibited. The headline of one local magazine read, "Lachi Bulumer's exhibition of work that learns to speak." I kept a copy of it tacked above my desk like a talisman. Otto and I grew closer with a steadiness that felt like an old-growth tree, slow, unflashy, rooted. We moved through the pragmatic parts of life, dinners, shared friends, conversations that could hold the history of a woman who had been to different people at once. There were tender nights and nights of complicated silence. We did not attempt to erase the years that had passed or make comic book promises of perfect happiness. We enjoyed books together and argued about paint thinner and traded recipes for winter soups. He asked me to marry him not in a barnstorm of extravagance, but with a ring he had found in a tiny antique shop, and a laugh that said he did not expect perfection. He expected companionship. Our wedding was small. We invited the people who had been quiet supports, and a few who had been loud obstacles. Dylan walked me down a short aisle in a garden where the flowers were not arranged to flatter anyone's taste, but to be themselves. Bradley did not attend. He sent a card that read like a contract. I folded it into a small square and put it in a drawer labeled History. In the months after the wedding, life found a new rhythm. The studio thrummed with students and occasional commissions. I taught and learned in equal measure. Otto and I kept certain things private and made others public in tiny increments. We hosted dinners where the conversation turned to architecture and painting and the right kind of soup for rainy days. We lived in the ordinary miracle of cohabitation to people each, with their histories, learning how to hold them in common. There were moments of awkwardness still. People who had known me for decades had to reorient the ways they called my name. It occurred to several old acquaintances to address letters to Mrs. Bradley Morrison before someone corrected them. Once, in a store, a clerk called me ma'am in a way that felt neutral and businesslike. I answered without flinching and then allowed myself a quiet smile. The phrase that had once lodged like a burr, treated like a maid, no longer had the same sting when I said it aloud. Because in reality, it was being replaced by something slowly reconstituted. A woman who could be seen for her work, and not merely for how neatly she arranged other people's worlds. One late afternoon, as the light lay like gold on the studio floor, Dylan brought Sophia by. They stood in the doorway like to people stepping into a small sun. Sophia hugged me and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this family." The sentence was unexpected. It suggested the kind of integration I had been afraid to hope for. Sophia's eyes were gentle when she looked at Otto, and her hand fit in Dylan's with an ease that made me think perhaps the next generation would learn. Different geographies of loyalty. There were still times when Bradley's presence loomed a tax farm here, a mutual acquaintance. Comment there. He sent a letter regarding a piece of art he claimed to have appreciated and asked, in a tone that tried to be grandfatherly, how I was doing. I sent a brief note back, thanking him for the thought and wishing him well. Some people want the last word. I had learned, painfully, that sometimes the last word is silence worn as dignity. Margaret and I met again, months after the apology, in a cafe where the light was soft and the muffins had a generous amount of sugar. She had aged in ways that made me think of Weathering Wood-honored and tired. She reached across the table and took my hand as if to ensure I was still there. "I don't want to be the type of person who pushes and then disappears," she said. "I wanted to help you then because I thought I knew best. I see now that I responded to fear by arranging you into safety, without asking if that was what you wanted. For that I'm sorry." Her humility was a small thing, but it mattered. Forgiveness does not always look like grand declarations. Sometimes it is tea in a tired cup, and an apology that arrives late because the pride that delayed it had, at last, worn thin. The years following the separation were kinder than I imagined they might be. I had a studio, a community of late bloomers, and a husband who called me by my full name in a way that felt like reverence. I had, too, the knowledge that my past had been complicated, that my choices had not been simple, and that truth had the capacity to unsettle people I loved. But the central truth remained. I was no longer someone whose worth was defined by how neatly she smoothed the edges of other people's lives. Once, years into this new life, Bradley and I met briefly at a charity event. He looked the way people look when they have lived in one skin for a long time, set, practiced, a little diminished. He offered a polite handshake and a bland remark about the event, and then we parted. The handshake felt like an old treaty, necessary, courteous, and finally done. He did not ask me to return to the role I had occupied for 39 years. He did not recognize that he had never really known the woman he lived with. He had known his version of me, the efficient hostess, the neat-handed wife, but he had never understood the interior geography of my childhood, the pressed flower, the poems I loved, or the way color could make me feel alive. He didn't know who I really was, I said later to Eto as we walked home from the car. The sentence did not carry accusation as much as an observation. People can spend decades beside us and never see the rooms inside. Some of them are too busy looking at the furniture to notice the building itself. Atto squeezed my hand and said, "We learn people slowly, if we are lucky. Sometimes it takes a while for the person next to you to emerge." The way he said it made room for the quieter truth that many people do not see each other at all, even when they sleep beneath the same roof. I think now about the arc of my life as a series of small red threads that connect moments. The napkin on the dress, the locket heavy on the pillow, the press of my son's hand when he first learned the truth. These are not lines that make a tidy story. They are edges of a life that was assembled slowly, imperfectly, and with courage not always measured in spectacles. There have been days since when I still find myself folding habit into an old shape, a voice softening where it would be useful to be firm and high, correct myself with a small internal nudge. There are mornings when the paint under my fingernails feels like a badge. There are afternoons when a student will ask me why I began painting at 60, and I will answer with the short, true line, "I stopped being someone's maid." Sometimes a young woman in class will clutch a brush as if it is an offering and ask if it is too late for her to begin. I tell them the same thing I tell myself. Beginnings are stubborn. They do not require permission. They require the willingness to hold the fear and step anyway. We had a small celebration on the first anniversary of the opening of the studio. People who had taught me to hold myself and those who had watched me relearn gathered. Dylan gave a short speech that made his voice crack, pride and apology braided so tightly that the sound made everyone else in the room look away. "You gave me the only thing a child should be given," he said. "You gave me a home and you always loved me. I wish the truth had arrived sooner. But what you have made since what you've become has taught me more about courage than I knew I still had to learn." I caught Margaret's eye during the applause. She was crying quietly, the way people cry when a lesson has washed through a life and left a clean space. We nodded to one another like conspirators who had learned from each other's mistakes. On the eve of my 60th birthday, Atto and I drove to the coast. It was a ritual more for him than for me. The coast had been a place he loved when he was young, and the rising tide had steadied his young ambitions. The ocean was wide and mercilessly honest. We walked along the shore, our shoes kicking wet sand, the air sharp as a new coin. Atto stopped and looked at me, not with the hunger of a man wanting more, but with the peaceful attention of someone who wanted to be present to the life we had made together. "You have always been more than you were allowed to be," he said. The sentence had the simplicity of a prayer. "And you," I said, "have been the kind of man who remembers the young promises when they mattered." We stood there a little while, listening to the world tide and fall. I thought of the napkin and the chandelier, and the way a public humiliation had become an axis upon which my life turned. I thought of the years I had lived in the soft hazard of not being noticed, and of the revolution of being seen. Seeing is not simply looking at. It is the labor of attention and acknowledgement. If there is a lesson in this life, it is this: the world will teach you what it expects of you, if you let it. People will hand you scripts in the small noises of everyday life. You can learn your lines and perform until your voice goes hoarse. Or you can, at certain moments, sometimes enormous, sometimes tiny, refuse the part you have been given. I still walk into rooms and feel, for an instant, like the woman who used to fold herself into other people's comfort. Habit is a stubborn animal. But now, when a server pauses awkwardly, or when a friend calls me dear in a tone that makes my skin prickle, I am quick to correct it. I speak my name, the full syllables that were given to me, and watch how the world listens. The last time someone told me I was helpful in a way that suggested a role rather than a person, I smiled and said, "I'm Elizabeth Marie." It felt small. It felt immense. It felt, finally, like the truth. If you are watching this, and you have sat with someone you loved for a long time without ever telling them a thing you carried, consider whether the comfort of silence is worth the cost. If you are on the other side, and you have held a secret from someone you love, know that truth can hurt and also heal. Names matter. Stories matter. The small things we keep in our pockets, the locket, the poems, the press of a flower, are not mere relics. They are evidence that we were not always the person the world asked us to be. I do not pretend this is an easy ending. There are still bills and phone calls, and the small arithmetic of living. There are also mornings when the light hits a canvas, and the color sings in a way that makes me want to cry. I have a husband who uses my name with reverence, a son who has learned new boundaries, and a community of women who paint with the wildness of late bloomers. I have forgiven and been forgiven in fits and starts. I have not erased the past. I have rearranged it so it no longer defines me. And there is something else, something I did not expect until it arrived as quietly as a postcard. Children of a life you thought was done come with tenderness. The emails from people who read a review and bought a painting. The woman who hugged me after a class and said, "You made me try." The anonymous note tucked into my mailbox that read, "I saw you at the gallery. You look like someone who has come home." These small messages are the echo of a life being seen and acknowledged. If you are here at the end with me, I will ask one small thing: if this story touched you, leave a note below telling me where you're watching from and what small thing you are keeping that you might one day choose to set down. That little exchange of place and of secret is how we learn we are not alone. I remember, sometimes, kneeling with a napkin on my dress and feeling like a weathered piece of furniture. I remember the humiliation, the way the room turned away, and Bradley snapped his fingers as if commanding the universe to stay obedient. I remember the smell of wine and the glitter of crystal and the way a simple gesture could render a person small. I also remember Atto kneeling beside me and calling my name the way someone calls down a lost thing. He didn't just see the stain, he saw the woman. He didn't know everything about me then, none of them did. But he recognized enough the book of poems, the pressed flower, the way my hands knew a brush to afford me the chance to become myself again. For that, I am grateful. It is never too late to rename yourself. It is never too late to choose dignity. It is never too late to start painting again. If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be this: you are worth more than the roles people will try to hand you. Hold the locket, keep the flower. And when the time comes, say the word no. Thank you for sitting with me in this memory. If you want to hear more stories like this, there are a few on the channel. I think you might like people who found themselves late, or who had to pick up the pieces of a life and rearrange them into something true. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. And tell me below where you're watching from: city, state, country. I read them all.